As soon as we got out the car, we ran up on the front yard and started busting at the house. Everyone shot their gun at the house from the outside. We all ran up on the porch and went inside. Is that all correct? Okay. Is that correct? Yeah, times when you shot your gun, I'm not sure, but I would say about 9 to 10 times. Is that correct? Yes. Has anyone threatened or promised you anything for your statement? And your answer was no.
This footage captures the moment 14-year-old Devontae Sanford confessed to gunning down 4 people in cold blood during a robbery gone wrong. His timed confession read to him by Sergeant Michael Russell, who had just spent hours interrogating the teen. The details of Devontae's admission were chilling and detailed. There was just one problem. Not a word of it was true. Growing up on Detroit's east side hadn't been easy for Devontae Sanford. His father was in prison by the time he was born, and his mother was hooked on crack. Blinded in one eye after a kid threw an egg at him at the age of 7, Devontae had long suffered learning and behavioral difficulties. He was easy pickings for local bullies. He had also moved from home to home and school to school. At age 14, he was in special education classes at Osborne High. Devontae had no criminal past, only a troubled one. Despite everything Devontae's been through, his family says he has a heart of gold, which just made the events that unfolded in 2007 that much more shocking. It was midnight on September 17, 2007, when Homicide Sergeant Michael Russell of the Detroit Police Department received a call from dispatch about a quadruple homicide on Runyon Street. He could hardly believe it. It was the second multiple shooting that day. When homicide investigators arrived at 19741 Runyon Street, they found a living room strewn with the bodies of 3 men and 1 woman, each with multiple gunshot wounds. The victims were identified as Danilo McCanillo, Brian Dixon, Nicole Chapman, and Michael Big Mike Robinson, a local marijuana dealer. Robinson was still sitting in the love seat where he had been watching TV an hour earlier. He had been shot 9 times. In the back bedroom of the house, police discovered another victim, wounded yet still alive, Valerie Glover and Robinson's 7-year-old son. While the boy was unharmed, Glover had been shot 5 times while crawling out of the living room to hide under the child's bed. Glover was lucky to be alive. The gunman had followed her, and instead of shooting them both, he told her to fake being dead until they left. Glover described him as a tall black male with a slim build and a soft voice. Meanwhile, eyewitnesses were offering police their own accounts. One local boy said he saw 2 suspect vehicles at the house, a white work van and a red Buick. Another said that the word on the street all week had been that Robinson had an argument with 2 local men who were planning some sort of payback. Another witness, a neighbor and cousin of Robinson's, said he saw 2 men leaving the house who opened fire on him before disappearing through a vacant lot. Hearing of the gunman, Sergeant Russell enlisted sniffer dogs to track their scent. The dogs led detectives through a vacant lot onto a sidewalk, and that was where they crossed paths with a shivering 5'5" teenage boy with a drooping eye. Devontae Sanford told detectives he lived at the end of the block and had come out to see what was going on. He had no information that could help them in their investigation, he said. Still, the officers got him chatting. It turned out Devontae had a relative who was a former homicide detective, a man called William Rice, and someone whom one of the officers happened to know. The officers called the former detective, who told them that Devontae knew everything that went on in that neighborhood, and he urged Devontae to be truthful with the investigators. Suddenly, Devontae started talking. He knew who did it. He said he even seen them run through his yard after the shooting and said they were part of a local gang. With his grandmother's written consent, they drove Devontae around town before revisiting the crime scene, testing him for gun residue, and then bringing him to the police headquarters around 4 a.m. Once there, Devontae waived his Miranda rights. An officer during an interrogation will use a variety of tactics to ease or pressure a guilty suspect into confessing their role in the crime. Some of these tactics include giving false incriminating evidence or making promises of a lesser penalty if the suspect cooperates. No one will ever know what tactics the police used in their interrogation of Devontae Sanford because none of it was videotaped. But over the next few days, the 14-year-old was interviewed by numerous police officers for hours at a time, each time without a lawyer or a parent present. In his typed confession, Devontae said that he and 4 friends had met at a Coney Island restaurant to plan a robbery of the Runyon house. They armed themselves with weapons, including an AK-47, but on the way, Devontae got cold feet and had gone home. Moments later, one of his friends, Tony, had run through his yard yelling that he had shot someone. It was then that Devontae had come out into the street. He played no role in the killings, he said. With his confession signed, police drove Devontae home. Devontae thought the ordeal was over, but by later that day, Sergeant Russell was skeptical. The more he looked into Devontae's story, the less it made sense. The Coney Island restaurant Devontae had mentioned had been closed for months. Witnesses only ever saw 2, not 4 men running from the house, and the caliber of guns Devontae described did not match the bullet casings found at the scene. At 8:40 p.m. that night, officers picked out Devontae once again, this time with his mother's consent, and brought him to the police headquarters for a second interview. This time, Commander James Tolbert was involved in the interrogation. They skipped videotaping the interview, but videoed Russell reading Devontae his revised statement. The officers made sure to read the statement slowly and ask simple yes or no questions in his revised version. Devontae said it wasn't the Coney Island restaurant that he and his friends met, but at his friend's mother's house, and he hadn't gotten cold feet but had actively been involved in the shootings. First, they shot up the outside of the house. When they entered, they found everyone dead or dying. Then they shot him again to make sure before fleeing and chucking the guns over a fence into a grassy lot. According to police, Devontae then sketched the interior of the house and the positions of the bodies placed side by side, with a police drawing of the crime scene. The placement of the bodies were nearly identical. That was information only the killer could have known. And yet problems with his story continued to arise. Each of his supposed accomplices had rock-solid alibis. No weapons were recovered from the area Devontae had indicated. There was, however, one new piece of evidence that suggested guilt. While the gun residue test of Devontae's hands had come back negative, the trousers that Sergeant Russell had retrieved from the house had tested positive. Devontae was interviewed for a third time. This time his story included the van that one of the witnesses spotted outside of the house. He changed his description of the weapons to match those of the casings found at the crime scene. Instead of his friends, he shifted the blame to his 3 cousins. In one final version offered during an interrogation interview, Devontae then denied it all. It wasn't me from the beginning anyway. It was my cousin. I told the police I didn't shoot one time because I was scared. I walked in the door and saw the bodies and got scared. Later, Devontae Sanford told a journalist from the New York Post that it wasn't until his arraignment that he fully understood the implications of his confession. That's when it really kicked in, he said. They're serious. Devontae's bench trial lasted less than 2 days and was held on March 17th and 18th of 2008. Wayne County prosecutor Kim Worthy led the case against Devontae, which rested largely on statements he made to the police, despite the fact that Devontae now claimed those statements were false. Devontae's attorney, Robert Slameka, now stepped in. His only hope of getting out of jail, Slameka said, was to plead guilty and accept a plea deal. Devontae's mother, Tamiko, recalled that Slameka told them there was too much evidence against him, and if he didn't accept the plea deal, he'd never see daylight again. The prosecution presented just 3 witnesses, Sergeant Michael Russell, a neighbor who had seen the 2 gunmen, and Valerie Glover, the woman who had survived the shootings. Glover testified that Devontae's voice sounded like the one she heard from under the bed. He sounded just like a little kid's, he said. On the second day of the trial, Devontae pled guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder. Despite his multiple confessions and their woeful inaccuracies, Devontae was sentenced to 37 to 90 years in a maximum security prison. "I just thought of all I lost," Devontae said. 1 month after Devontae was sentenced in April of 2008, 27-year-old Vincent Smothers, a self-professed hitman, sat in a Detroit interrogation room. He had just been arrested. Now it seemed he was intent on getting everything off of his chest. He had been on a 2-year killing spree, he told detectives during a taped confession. There were at least 12 victims, and 4 of them, he said, were from 19741 Runyon Street. He described how he and alleged accomplice Ernest Davis were paid by another drug dealer to kill Mike Robinson. One of the officers that day was Sergeant Russell, the same man who interrogated Devontae Sanford when Smothers claimed responsibility for the Runyon Street murders. Russell, he recalled, looked flabbergasted. The implication was clear. Right or wrong, the case was closed. The police were not interested in Smothers' confession. It would make the whole department look incompetent. And then there were the potentially serious recriminations that would stem from framing an innocent 14-year-old boy. It didn't matter if a kid's future was at stake. This was a can of worms they were not prepared to open. The police adopted a deliberate blind spot to Smothers' confession. He was interrogated on the details of every case except for the Runyon murders. Within months of Sanford's conviction, the state appellate defender's office took up Devontae's case and assigned him a new appellate attorney by the name of Kim McGinnis. It was just the start of multiple appeals that were set to span the next 7 years. During those years, Devontae Sanford spent most of his time in solitary confinement. Much of this was for his own protection from other inmates. Later, he would describe the torment of the experience of being locked in a cell alone for 18 to 23 hours a day for years. "What do you expect to come out of that?" he said. "It's going to be a monster." Even the public were enraged by the lack of evidence in the conviction of the 14-year-old boy. McGinnis filed a motion to withdraw Sanford's guilty plea in the fall of 2008, arguing that his confession and guilty plea were the result of police coercion, bad advice from a bad lawyer, and immaturity. Devontae Sanford had been poorly represented by his lawyer. Schlemecker, she argued, a man with a checkered career that included 17 reprimands for failing to provide adequate defense to his clients. Schlemecker didn't try to get Devontae's statements thrown out, despite having valid reasons for doing so. He never cross-examined Sergeant Russell. Sergeant Mike Russell's handling of the case was also criticized heavily. He had interviewed Devontae twice without videotaping it. He failed to read him his Miranda rights until after he had made his confession and did not notify his mother that she had the right to be there with him. As for Devontae Sanford's confession, it was inconsistent, factually flawed, taken without a parent or attorney present, and one that he said was coerced into giving. Devontae had been shown pictures of the bodies, he said, and in the end he made something up, expecting to be allowed to go home. Meanwhile, no one told McGinnis of Smothers' confession. She learned of it on a local news broadcast in late 2008. She filed a new motion that included the confession. Soon afterwards, Smothers and Devontae met by chance in the bullpen. Smothers allegedly told Devontae, "I'm the one who did the shooting on Runyon. You'll be going home soon, don't worry about it." But during the Michigan Court of Appeals, Smothers refused to testify, pleading the Fifth. He was worried that naming his former associate would put him and his family in danger, he said. Later, when he agreed to testify, Judge Brian Sullivan, who had presided over Devontae's 2-day trial, refused to allow him to do so. In 2012, Smothers submitted an affidavit that said Devontae Sanford was innocent. Sullivan denied the motion to withdraw the guilty plea. Meanwhile, more exonerating evidence emerged. Ballistics evidence showed the cartridge casing at the crime scene matched a .45 caliber linked to Smothers, and that the bullets at the scene had been fired from the same AK-47 used in another of Smothers' homicides. Regarding the gunshot residue on Devontae's trousers, it was revealed that he shared his closet with other teens, and Devontae's account scarcely matched the evidence of the crime scene, while Smothers matched it flawlessly. In April of 2015, the University of Michigan Innocence Clinic and the Northwestern University School of Law Center for Wrongful Convictions of Youth filed an effort to free Devontae Sanford, a motion for release of judgment. The proceedings would go on for over a year. The argument was that they had uncovered new evidence and information that was not available in 2007 or 2008, which further implicated Smothers and cleared Devontae of the Runyon killings. The proceedings went on for more than 2 years, and with it emerged a picture of police force rampant with misconduct, practices, and corruption. Commander James Talbot, who has testified that the drawings done entirely in Sanford's own hand, admitted to detectives that he had drawn the map of the crime scene himself. Yet prosecutors Kim Worthy announced that she would not bring charges against James Talbot for perjury. Ira Todd, an investigator with the Detroit Police Violent Crimes Task Force, learned that Smothers had connections with high-level drug dealers who had his own connections to the former Detroit mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick. After Smothers was arrested, Todd testified that he was hindered in his investigation of Smothers and later removed from the case. Another officer, Sergeant David Cobb, was named by Smothers in a confession involving a successful hit on Cobb's wife. Cobb was arrested but later released by the county on the basis of a lack of evidence. Cobb later committed suicide. In May 2016, the Michigan State Police conducted an investigation into the Devontae Sanford's case. The findings of their investigation were conclusive. Smothers and Ernest David were guilty of the Runyon killings, while Devontae Sanford had no involvement. On June 7th, Judge Brian Sullivan vacated Devontae's sentence, and on June 8th, Devontae walked out of the Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility a free man. He had been in prison for 9 years. I just want to try to put this behind me and move on with my life and move forward with my family, Sanford told a reporter. Take one day at a time, one step at a time.